Welcome to Trending Faith. I'm here with Tim. Tim, how are you doing?
Doing great, thanks.
Got a question for you today.
Okay.
It says, my friend wants to go see a psychic just for fun. Is it okay to go if I'm a Christian? Does Scripture say anything about psychics?
Well, it's a great question. I think a lot of people are looking for ways to entertain themselves, and I think it's interesting when you read through the book of Acts, you'll see a variety of scenes where the early church and believers in that day were accustomed to being around psychics and sorcerers and magicians of all shapes and sizes. And you see in a few chapters in the book of Acts where the church had to kind of respond to that and react to it. Chapter 8, chapter 16, and chapter 19 in particular have these very interesting scenes about the early church responding to how people were connected to sorcerers or magicians, psychic-type individuals. And I think more than entertainment, it was probably more meaningful to people in that day and age. People seemed to come up with very unusual experiences and had a way of interacting with people in society at that time that was pretty compelling. And yet, the early church began to realize that these activities were not consistent with what they were learning about following Jesus. And so there was some pushback about those kinds of activities. And so I think the early church realized that there were things that were characteristic of people that did things like that probably weren't consistent with the Spirit of God. And so, throughout a variety of the epistles, you see Paul and other writers kind of warning the church to be careful when you're dealing with other spirits, when you're dealing with sorcery or magic, that you're fooling around with stuff that's probably dangerous, spiritually dangerous. So I can see why people, even Christians, would feel kind of interested in maybe, hey, going just for the fun of it, but you're probably playing with fire, at least from my view. I don't know if you have dealt with anybody that's kind of played around in this area. I have, and it seems like one thing kind of leads to the other. It starts out with like Ouija boards, just kind of a fun board game, and you can get into some pretty serious spiritual stuff. So you got to be really careful with that.
Yeah, I don't know if you've run into this, but sometimes people think it's kind of fun because, hey, ghosts and goblins and demons and devils and all that, that's all kind of silly anyway. Mm-hmm. I think it's almost like a modern thing. We don't take the spirit world seriously. Yeah. So that may be sort of behind the question that's being asked here. Is it okay just to play around with that? I don't know if you've seen The Mentalist on TV. I don't even know if it's still on, but in The Mentalist, the main character was it was a hoax. He was a former psychic who made money fooling people, and he wasn't for real. But sometimes we have that mentality, and we don't think about the fact that people are interacting with the spirit world and demonic forces, and that there's a deception there. It can be very dangerous, I think. So if a person began to move down this path, if somebody started to play around with a Ouija board or to visit a psychic or interact with a medium, and what do you see? What's the future of that? Where does that go south in terms of their relationship with God?
Well, I think it's kind of an unknown road, I think, for a lot of folks. I think they might step into something where they think this is just fun and meaningless, but for others, it may draw them into other experiences that are darker and more spiritual. I think demon possession and oppression is just as real today as it was in biblical times. It just may manifest itself in different ways. And I think a lot of Christians today kind of look at what happened in the days of Christ and kind of go, well, it was, that was then. That kind of stuff doesn't happen today. And I wonder if there are a lot of societal ills and issues that we deal with that are really spiritual in nature. And sometimes when you get on a road where you're playing around with evil spirits in some way, that it'll take you into experiences that I don't think is meant for the believer, and can be a real struggle for Christians when they don't anticipate ending up there. And it may start with a harmless game or an entertainment experience, and the next thing you know, they're entertaining, well, maybe I ought to consider other things. Maybe there's something to this dark world that is interesting. We're adrenaline junkies. We're always looking for something to kind of, make us a little bit more curious about the world than we might be in the moment. And all of a sudden we find ourselves being entertained and interested and curious about things that are pretty risky.
So if a person was in fact looking for something that would replace that adrenaline rush that they might have, flirting with something demonic or playing with the spiritual world, what might be a constructive replacement? What would you do instead?
Well, it's pretty challenging these days because the dark side of life is made so interesting by media, whether it be films, whether it be comic books. There's a lot of things that are out today that are made to be so interesting that deals with the dark side of life. And so when you start talking about, God's power at work in a person's life and Him bringing about certain levels of satisfaction, experience in this life, it almost is not as interesting as it is the dark side of things. But for those who have walked with Jesus for a period of time and have learned to trust Him and learned to experience the adventure of walking with God, and you find those opportunities and occasions in life to where you see God at work in a conversation, in a relationship, in a situation, a set of circumstances where only God could put things together, that becomes incredibly exciting for a believer. But a believer has to be interested in going down that path and seeing God at work in those kinds of situations. But those things aren't highlighted. They're not valued as much as they once were in our society. And it seems like the dark things seem to have more prominence. I mean, like we've talked about this before, the whole idea of vampires, how that thing blew up, for a number of years, kind of not as popular as it once was. But I mean, those turned feature films, and people were buying books, and everybody was interested in that, and it was just made very compelling. It's hard to find many doing that with great spiritual, positive stories. I don't know, maybe people think they just don't sell. I don't know what the reason is for that, but it's kind of endemic with our society today that the dark arts are more popular than things of God. So
thanks, Tim. That's helpful. I appreciate it, and I appreciate the question as well. So thank you so much for watching.